In video games, you can move your controller around to aim. This will give you more control and a higher accuracy than what you would be able to achieve with just the analog sticks. This is something that you can easily test by going to aim labs. If you use aim labs to gauge your accuracy with the analog stick, and then compare it to how accurate you can be using a gyro, you will very quickly find that there's no comparison. Gyro aiming is not quite as good as mouse aiming, but it is close, and it comes with the added benefit of being able to use it on your controller, which means you won't have to be at your desk. You'll be able to comfortably be at your couch or on your bed, while also enjoying a near mouse level of accuracy. Unfortunately, gyro aiming has a relatively high barrier to entry. Most games don't support it, so you'll have to set it up yourself. If you go on YouTube and look up a tutorial on how, you'll find that they're all lengthy and complicated. They're that way because there are lots of little problems that can arise, so they're trying to get you to set it up one time and then not worry about it so much later. However, what happens practically is people that have developed a mild interest in gyro will look at these complicated videos, and at that point many will decide it's not worth it. Meaning that we're missing out on potential gyro devotees. Gyros are my version of the flying car. Sometimes you'll hear people be like, we should have had flying cars by now. Well, I think we should have stopped using these antiquated analog sticks and moved forward into a gyro society. But we haven't. The Xbox controller doesn't have a gyro. The PlayStation controller does have a gyro, but it's rarely used in most video games. And even in situations where developers want to implement the gyro and do, it's often not very good. Still, it's undeniable that gyro is in a better position now than it has ever been historically, due mainly to the efforts of two companies, Nintendo and Valve. Probably Nintendo has done more than anyone to gyro pill the population. They've been using gyro extensively since the Wii U. And it was probably Breath of the Wild that made me realize that aiming with the gyro was way faster, more efficient, and more precise than trying to do it with the analog stick. And since then I've noticed that developers seem to put more effort into developing gyro controls on the Switch than they do on other consoles. For example, Doom 2016 has really good gyro controls on the Switch, but the PlayStation 5 version of it doesn't, despite the fact that the PlayStation 5 controller also has gyro capabilities. There's no reason why it couldn't have it, which I think is an indication that Nintendo is nudging developers along, trying to get them to implement gyro into their games. With surprising success. The Switch versions of Portal 2, Portal 1, Resident Evil 5 and 6, Superhot, Overwatch, Wolfenstein, Turok 2, Jedi Academy, Jedi Outcast, all the Borderlands games. It's a huge list, a gigantic list of companies that are not under Nintendo's control that have implemented gyro for the Nintendo Switch. Most of these are situations where they did not implement it on the PS5 version, which I think is an indication that it was at Nintendo's behest. They believe in gyro. They know that gyro is amazing. And there's no better evidence of that than Splatoon. The Splatoon games are built from the ground up for gyro, and the majority of the player base uses the gyro. In fact, Splatoon is probably the game that has done the most to popularize the gyro. Because the main focus of Splatoon isn't necessarily the story, many people play it for its competitive online multiplayer. The PvP is the main game mode. So you have a popular PvP-oriented game where almost the entire player base is using the gyro. And gyro use is the dominant culture. Any newcomer that adopts the game will have to use gyro if they want to play well. If they choose not to, it will quickly become apparent that they're at a huge disadvantage. Now, Nintendo probably has done the most to gyro pill people, but Valve has done the most to make it possible to play with gyro on almost any game. Steam has Steam Input. Steam Input is the software on Steam that translates your controller inputs to whatever you want them to be. This allows you to play any game with any controller. You can reconfigure controller inputs freely, and this will even work for games that don't have controller support, because it'll translate the controller inputs into mouse and keyboard inputs. Most importantly for this discussion, it can translate gyro inputs into mouse inputs, and so the gyro will behave as a mouse. One of the reasons that you can get mouse-like accuracy is basically because it is a mouse, it's acting like a mouse. And this is something that can be turned on for basically any game on Steam. Even better, Steam Input is extremely programmable. You can have the gyro turn on only when you toggle a certain button. You can have it turn on only when you're holding down the aim button, and in all other situations it's off. You can set it up in any number of different ways. It's a wonderful technology. What gives me even more hope is the Switch 2. the Joy-Cons on it seem to be able to function as a mouse. This was a rumor that was circulating around before the Switch 2 reveal, and then on the reveal itself you see the Joy-Cons drifting around as if they were mice. And this is super important for our gyro discussion, because what this means is that many games, maybe most games, especially anything that has to do with aiming, is going to support these mouse inputs. This is the biggest feature that differentiates the Switch 2 from the Switch 1. If we assume that Nintendo asked for and incentivized developers to include gyro controls in the Switch release of their titles, then it's safe to assume they'll do the same for their mouse controls. In fact, they'll probably be even more insistent on it. Mouse inputs, mouse controls are not this fringe thing like the gyro is. I would not at all be surprised if it was a thing that almost any game that involves aiming could make use of. And this is a very important information for the gyro, because like I mentioned, the gyro can act like a mouse. In fact, in its best implementations, it does act like a mouse. And if mouse controls are implemented across a wide variety of Switch 2 games, then it would be the easiest thing in the world to have the gyro act as that mouse across all of those games. There would be no reason not to. Mouse controls would already be set up for these games. Having the gyro act as that mouse would be as simple as pushing a button. I personally believe it's a foregone conclusion that that is what's going to happen. Gyro is going to explode in popularity. Every single Switch 2 game that is controllable with a mouse will by default have gyro functionality. And this puts the gyro in a very good position. Between the ubiquity of Steam input and the Switch 2 putting gyro aiming in front of so many new people, I hope and expect the adoption and standardization of this aiming method to accelerate. The future is very bright. But there's still one problem. There's one obstacle that has prevented gyro's widespread adoption on Steam, and that's that it's a pain to set up. And that's through no fault of Valve. Steam input works great. You can just turn it on, it takes a few seconds. But just as often as not, it'll create strange artifacts because the games aren't set up to allow gamepad and mouse inputs. That's why you have these 20-minute long tutorials on YouTube showing you how to set up the gyro aiming. It's to standardize it and help you avoid the most common problems that show up on a lot of games. But even these aren't enough because games will often have strange, nuanced problems that the standardized solution doesn't work on. And most people are just not going to deal with that. The barrier to entry is too annoying. So, since I think that the Switch 2 will have default mouse-like gyro functionality, and since I expect that will increase its popularity, my hope is that that standardization bleeds back into the normal gaming market. With its increased power, the Switch 2 will have access to many more shooters than the Switch 1 did. Those shooters I expect will have mouse and gyro functionality, meaning the developers that make those games will have gained experience on how to make the gyro work on the Switch 2. As I mentioned before, and I keep mentioning, since the Switch 2 has mouse controls, implementing the gyro won't be as hard as it was for previous games. They won't have to devote a bunch of resources to it. They just need to let the gyro act as that mouse. If they do that for the Switch 2 and the process is relatively painless, they may then decide to implement that feature on the PlayStation and Steam releases, creating a cascade effect that will lead to me no longer having to live in this stupid, dumb, gyroless, dumb analog stick world.